I think we can now move to the next session, which is on the macro impacts of physical and transition risks from a particularly strong policy perspective. And in this panel, which will last 1 hour, we have three extremely distinguished speakers. The first one is Nick Stern, who is Professor of Economics at LSE and chair of the influential think tank Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change. And he's held posts at other UK and overseas universities and as chief economist at both the EBRD and the World Bank. He has been knighted for services to economics, made a life peer, and he has published more than very influential 15 books and 100 articles. We're delighted that you will be speaking now. And I want to ask you if you could kindly focus on to open the discussion by talking about the urgency of strengthening the policies aimed to accelerate the green transition and the available options and challenges that you see necessary to achieve it. For example, the urgency of the situation and the need and scale for investment in green projects and the fact that these are not growing fast enough. And more broadly, we would really appreciate if you could refer to the macroeconomic challenges of the transition. And also, because we are privileged to have on this panel two very senior people from multilateral development banks, it would be great if you can raise some issues especially relevant for multilateral development banks, as well as, of course, for central banks. Thank you very much, Nick, for being with us. And you have 13 minutes as panelists.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for that very kind introduction, and to my great friend Luis Pereira da Silva for being the life force behind the whole activities of the Green Swan, and welcomed to my book-lined and somewhat chaotic academic study at the LSE. I also wanted to thank Mark Carney for his leadership. And rather importantly, Stephanie, we remember today our great friend Michael Lipton, who we sadly lost a few weeks ago, who would have been at the heart of this kind of discussion. I want to respond to your request, Stephanie, by beginning with the physical side and emphasizing the magnitude of the risks we run. Indeed, as Mark Carney said, this is macro critical in terms of the physical impacts, and it's macro critical in terms of the transition that we have to make, and particularly the scale of investment that we have to make. But let me start with illustrating some of the physical side. You will know much of this, but it's very important to underline it. And let me just take examples from the last year. The floods in Pakistan in the summer of last year killed at least 1,500 people, probably an underestimate, and 33 million were displaced. 45% of the cotton crop was lost. These kinds of things are surely macro by anybody's standards. In the same summer of last year, China experienced extreme drought and really disrupting in a major way its whole system of hydroelectric power, which cut off supplies to key production areas, including Swan, and affecting the global supply chains for lithium batteries and other products. In West Africa last year, we saw huge floods which left hundreds of thousands of people homeless in Nigeria and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those are macro effects. Last year, the Philippines witnessed several strong typhoons where, again, you have hundreds of thousands of people's lives and livelihoods severely disrupted and massive loss of life. That is climate change seen at 1.1 degree centigrade. We're heading for something which is much bigger than that on current policies, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees, depending on what assumptions you make about what current policies really are. We haven't been at 3 degrees as a world for around 3 million years, when sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than now. At 3 degrees, probably hundreds of millions, actually probably billions, would have to move, because where they live now would be underwater or part of a desert, or subject to constant battering from typhoons and hurricanes. That kind of movement of people would surely increase very substantially the risk of conflict. That is macro critical by anybody's standards. So if we recognize that, we recognize that we really have to change. If we recognize, as Mark Carney said, that we're going to exhaust the budget on current policies for 1.5 degrees, the emissions budget this decade, you have a very clear, I think, understanding of the urgency and scale of the change that we need to make. Delay is dangerous. Kicking the can down the road is dangerous. Whilst we have to make very big changes, and I'll just come to that now, whilst we have to make very big changes, the biggest damage, the biggest risk is from not acting at all. So we do have to change. We do have to change quickly. It will not be easy. But the most difficult strategy would be what Mark Carney called the timidity trap. So let's be very clear on that. I didn't produce any examples from Latin America, but with Ilan and Stephanie on the call, I'm sure they will be coming. But we've got to recognize the damage that could come from tipping points. If we lose the Amazon forest, as we might, then the river in the sky in Latin America disappears and Sao Paulo becomes a desert. Now, we really have to recognize the magnitude of those risks. I cannot dwell on it here. I've written about it elsewhere. But if we look at climate modeling, they simply do not capture the scale of the risks. The integrated assessment models generally are very modest in their representation of climate risk. And the climate scientists tear their hair out about the disparity between what they are talking about and what appears in many of the economic models. And that's a bridge which many of us are trying to build between the climate science and the economic modeling. All I can say at the moment is beware the standard integrated assessment models. It really they don't capture in their present structures the scale of the kind of risk we were just describing. So let me turn to what we have to do. Well, Mark's already begun that discussion. We have to invest in the world at least 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP more to make the changes and build a new capital in our cities and in our land that we have to make. That's based on work which many of us have done. The International Energy Agency has done some, the OECD has done some. My colleagues Vera Songwe and Amar Bhattacharya and I published a report for the COP27 last year on the scale of investment that is necessary. In many developing countries, it'd have to be more than 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. But therein lies the growth story, which Mark Carney referred to. Many of the areas of investment now are in particularly the energy sector, where the clean is already cheaper than the dirty. Investing in the clean is investing in the cheaper, improves productivity. A lot of the investment is around efficiency of energy use and efficiency of resource use more generally. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. Cities where you can move and breathe are much more productive. If we stop killing people we're killing people at 5 or 10 million a year from air pollution and maiming many more. Good health is good health and valued as such, but it's also better health increases productivity. And of course, the investment itself will drive growth forward. And it's investment that wouldn't happen unless we really focused our attention on the challenge at hand, which is climate change. So you can see why I speak of the growth story of the 21st century. There's no conflict between action on climate change and economic growth. Actually, it's the opposite. Action on climate change will drive economic growth for all the reasons I've just described. We're investing in the Schumpeterian innovations of the future, the technologies of the 21st century, not of the 19th. This is the growth story, but it's not easy, and it entails major investment, and it involves some dislocation, which has to be managed. So that's the challenge. How do we get that increase in investment? And when we recognize that the investment in emerging markets and developing economies is of special importance here. Um, well, in Africa, for example, the solar is cheaper than fossil fuel electricity, provided the cost of capital is around 6 or 7% or so, but not when the cost of capital is the 15, 20% or more that many of those countries have to face. So as we look at the generation of those flows of investment, we have to think first of the conditions for investment, and there the MDBs are very important as partners in creating the conditions for investment, the investment climate, the platform, but also in bringing down the cost of capital. And they are mutually supportive. The investment is more likely if affordable capital is available, but of course the conditions for investment have to be created, and there MDBs are at center stage as partners. But country risk, of course, will be very important in the cost of capital. It's not just the multilateral development banks, it's the international financial system with the IMF and the BIS and so on at its core as well, that has to help tackle the problems of debt and country risk. Veerasamway Amabhattacharya and myself looked at the scale of finance that was necessary to finance the investments that we need for delivery on the Paris Agreement, and we suggested that the overall investment in emerging markets and developing economies outside China would have to be around $1 trillion. The overall investment would have to be around $2.4 trillion a year as a flow by 2030. And if you assume that a majority of that is internally financed, but you don't make too strong assumptions on that, you get to flows that would be necessary of around $1 trillion a year into emerging markets and developing economies outside China by 2030. Majority private sector, but that private sector majority can't happen without the right conditions for investment and the right kind of sharing, reducing, managing of risk that the MDBs can do so well. I was chief economist of a regional bank and of the World Bank, and I know that they can do these jobs well. They haven't always done them well. They often have done them well. And I think that is something where the scale up is critically important. We calculate that if you're going to get those flows, and even with a majority private sector, you're going to need a tripling of lending from MDBs in the next 5 years. And of course, done in a way that manages to keep capital affordable. You're going to need with that, because a lot of the things you want to do, for example, in natural capital around adaptation and resilience, are quite difficult, not impossible, but quite difficult to bring in private sector money on the scale and cost that would be necessary. So we're going to need ODA, we're going to need voluntary carbon markets, we're going to need use of the SDRs, we're going to need philanthropy, and we may need new sources of finance, which I know will be discussed at the Paris Summit later this month. For example, taxation of shipping or aviation. So I've tried to tell the story that is one where these huge opportunities in our hands allow us to think of a new form of development, a new, cleaner, more attractive, more efficient, more productive form of growth, one that's in harmony with natural capital. It's in our hands, but I do not want to pretend that it's easy. It's hard. You've got to increase the investment. You've got to manage the dislocation. You've got to bring down the cost of capital. You've got to build partnerships with the private sector, which really don't exist on anything like the scale that we need at the moment. So it's a huge opportunity, but it's going to take strong action to get there. A final word on natural capital and nature. Climate change undermines biodiversity. A loss of biodiversity makes the climate challenge much more difficult. Burning fossil fuels damages our natural capital and our biodiversity directly, including through as well as the route through climate change. We're close to tipping points, and biodiversity reminds us that we can have sudden collapses in forests or species and so on. So as we think of the importance of the climate, I think we have to think of it as integrated with the whole issue of biodiversity. They're not separate subjects. There's very high overlap in effects, very high overlap in causes. Of course, some aspects of biodiversity loss are not through climate, things like overfishing and so on. But we have to treat them together. We shouldn't see one in, as it were, in opposition to the other, and we should never forget either one of them. So let me close on that note. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for drawing us together.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that wonderful presentation. And also very grateful you mentioned our dear late friend, Michael Lipton, in remembrance of him. On a purely administrative level, I wanted to ask attendees if they're interested in asking questions from our brilliant speakers, if you can put them into the chat, and then we will put them in the final part of the session. I think you highlighted so many important points, but if I may just mention the important point you made about climate modeling and that it is insufficient in capturing risks, climate risks, the scale of the investment needed, and particularly of the flows required by 2030 of $1 trillion going to emerging and developing countries. And therefore, the crucial need for multilateral development banks, as you quantified it, to triple their lending so that they can help finance and catalyze private investment. And finally, I think it's very positive that you ended on this note of talking about new development model that can be more dynamic and more productive. So now I want to ask Ilan Goldfein and then Deborah Roltella to talk about the views of their respective institutions on these challenging matters, what measures and policies they see as priorities in general, and especially what concrete actions their institutions are planning to implement over the next 5 years to contribute in a crucial way to this process. Especially, Ilan, we would be grateful if you could talk about the key dimensions to accelerate the transition, the need for more capital for MDBs, as well as new instruments, and show how central banks and financial supervisors need to change regulations to foster green investment, including by pricing the risk of climate change fully. And of course, what the IDB is planning to do in these lines. I want to just briefly mention the many attributes on Ilan's CV. Ilan has recently been elected IDB president. He served before as director of Western Hemisphere Department at the IMF, and before that, he was governor of the Central Bank do Brazil, and before that, deputy governor. So he has a major curriculum, and he has also had several important roles in top public sector institutions as consultant like the World Bank, the United Nations, and the IMF. We really look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much, Ilan.
Thank you, Stephanie. Great to be here. It's an honor and special to be here. Several aspects of today's conference are very close to my heart. It's a central bank, BIS conference, a financial system conference. I spent several years in my previous lives, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here, align the IDBs, MDBs with the central bank community and the BIS. Second, the seminar is about a major priority of us and the IDB, the climate transition and the macro consequences. This is a major global challenge, but it's a major regional challenge, one that needs all our attention and collaboration. And third, and not last, have a close interest to Chile, but to the region in particular. This is the mandate of the IDB, where I spent my whole career looking at the region. So we are here at the IDB and in the region to improve lives, and the climate challenge is very important. So let me start saying why I believe the region is crucial to this issue. Second, what institutions like the IDB will be doing and are doing, and I'll give you specific examples, what we are doing and plan to do. And finally, how can we align with the central bank community in order to face this challenge, this very large scale and in impact that we need. First, let me say that when it comes to climate change, few regions are as critical to our shared global future as Latin America and the Caribbean. I can start with the first example. Nick Stern mentioned the close relationship between biodiversity, natural capital, and climate change. And as you know, we are now in a new effort on the preservation of the Amazon forest. We are now looking how important it is to align the 8 countries in the region to be able to have a holistic view, holistic approach to defend the Amazon, its diversity, because if we don't protect the Amazon, we will severely reduce our capacity to meet the Paris climate targets. So as Nick mentioned, those climate change and the biodiversity and deforestation for us are very linked, and it's very important for the region. Second, also a closed team to climate. The world's leading net food exporter is Latin America. It produces food to feed 1.3 billion people, which is double its population. If you do it correctly, you will be able to alleviate global food insecurity while protecting its ecosystems and transitioning to net zero. If we don't tackle climate change, natural disasters and extreme weather could put that food security at risk. So Latin America can and must be part of the solution to shared global problems like deforestation, natural capital, but also food security. And the last one is directly on clean energy. Some of the countries in the region are global leaders in transition to net zero emission, like Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, are all recognized internationally for putting forward 3 of the 6 best climate strategies of the world. As you know, today, almost 30% of Latin America energy comes already from renewable. And when you look at sub-regions like Central America, that figure is already 80%. And as the world moves towards electric vehicles and renewable electricity, Latin America and the Caribbean is home to 2/3 of world's lithium and 38% of its copper that are crucial to the green transition. So again, the region could be part of the solution. It's critical for the climate transition, and it's a source of clean energy to the world, using basically its competitive advantage and natural attributes to help solve this global challenge. So what is the role of an institution like the IDB? The IDB is the region's leading multilateral institution, regional, is the leading partner for climate action in the region. We have several dimensions for that. Let's start with mitigation. So we are clearly elevating climate to ensure that it's central to every project we do. Today, climate action is one of this new administration's priorities. We are now discussing our institutional strategy. We're going to ensure our focus on scaling. And as several of you mentioned, the scale of the task is daunting. We have targets we are hitting, actually, we're surpassing our targets of allocating resources percentage to climate finance. That gives us quite a bit of resources to climate. But of course, we need to mobilize much more than what our capital today gives us. We need to be aligned and help countries be aligned with the Paris targets. We became this year the first MDB, and I will incentivize all the others also to assess all new loans for compatibility to low greenhouse gas and climate resilient economies, allowing each of our loans to Paris Agreement goals. There is a methodology, it has been negotiated, it needs to be implemented. We are one of the first to implement in all our loans. And as I mentioned, we have a daunting transition to do, and we are advising our countries. One of the issues that is very important for the region is adaptation. Climate change is have already arrived in the region, and I'm not only talking about the Caribbean and the Central America. The region is being affected, so we need to design bankable projects on adaptation to most of the region and to be able to project what we need to do to help countries to adapt, to have resilience. Deforestation and biodiversity, I already mentioned, the Amazon regional project that we are embarking and coordinating. And one thing that's important, if we're gonna scale, we need to use the right instrument. So we have been developing financial innovation for climate. We just announced with the government of Ecuador, the world's largest debt for nature conservation. In Ecuador, we have been receiving quite a bit of demand for debt swaps. And now debt swaps not only for nature, but debt swaps for climate. That has been a huge demand lately. I think it joins two important problems, debt in the region and the climate challenge. And countries are increasingly worried about the two, and debt for climate conversion is one of the instruments. But that's not the only instrument. We do have sustainability-linked bonds, which basically gives you lower interest rates if you achieve the targets that you designed for yourself. And that was the case recently with Chile and Uruguay, one of the first to link key environmental performance indicators to the cost of the loan. And last, in terms of instrument, we need to have our own loans contingent on achieving the KPIs. And we are now mobilizing pilot phase with concessional funds so that we give the right incentives to our members countries when they receive the loans to really reach the targets. And finally, of course, climate emergency funding. And we have been now creating a contingent credit facility for natural finance disaster emergencies. They are not only for hurricanes and other natural disasters in the Caribbean, and that's very important, but we have seen in South America, the droughts in Uruguay and Argentina. We have seen the fires in Chile. We have seen the floods in Brazil. So we do have already quite a bit of emergencies, and we have designed, and already 12 countries have been using this credit contingent facility for 2.6 billion so far. And for emergencies and exposed, we need to design climate resilient debt clauses. And there are two countries that have already have loans with these clauses, Bahamas and Barbados, where your debt, your principal debt is delayed if you have an emergency, if you have a natural disaster. So there's quite a bit that MDBs can do on mitigation, on helping on resilience and adaptation, on biodiversity and the Amazon, on new financial instruments, and on climate emergency funding. But That doesn't mean that this is all because there is life beyond financing. Knowledge and capacity building. We do have capacity building needs in the countries that goes beyond what MDBs are doing. MDBs could be very effective, but if there's no capacity to implement the projects, we are not going to be effective. So we are designing platforms where you can exchange experiences, and we are also designing project facilities for the region where we give technical assistance to have the right projects for climate in the region. Before I go to the conclusion, I want to take this opportunity to talk about where central banks and BIS can pair with MDBs to help us with this daunting task. So first, we understand that regulation and supervision needs to be there. And I already see quite a bit of the central banks working on that, incorporating climate risk into the financial regulation. And I also see that there's quite a bit of guidance, as Mark already mentioned, on disclosures. And we're already seeing some of the countries, including in the region, like Colombia and Brazil, implementing climate stress tests. So it looks like central banks are going in the right direction in terms of the regulation, supervision. But there's more to do. We need to support the development of markets, of green financial markets. Central banks can encourage green financial markets by facilitating green bond issuance, developing and enforcing green bond standards together with other regulators. And we need to collaborate with other stakeholders so that they can be with us, helping the environment, the institutions, so that investment can come easier. But I do believe that we need also to exchange information, incorporate climate change into the agendas. And I know the network of greening the financial system aim to strengthen central banks' climate strategies and to integrate climate-related risks. But I must tell you that central banks in the region have also asked us to support, to create technical cooperation under our regional public good initiative, because we need, for some of the central banks, to provide capacity, and we are looking toward cooperating with you on providing this capacity. Last but not least, let me be a more exploratory approach. Climate financing needs scale. Talk about the 1 trillion, but I think we need quite a bit. In the IDB, we will be supporting green investment via blended finance, is the use of donors' money, concessional money with the loans. And we believe that maybe we could have the central banks somehow think about how can they help directly. Of course, they're doing it indirectly, but directly, either via the regulation, the development bank supervision, to provide access to affordable capital with new instruments. Blended finance mechanisms can take the various forms, including guarantees, concessional loans, technical assistance, risk-sharing arrangement. The multilaterals are working on that. The IDB is working on these modalities. And the central banks also think a way to help us with these instruments, with this blended finance, so that we can mobilize more capital and we can reach maybe the 1 trillion it's needed, which is far beyond what we have today available. So thank you very much and look forward to the questions in this panel.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, which was so informative, so wide-ranging. I think it's interesting that you highlighted the critical role that Latin America and the Caribbean can play in food provision, in clean energy, which it can even export through green hydrogen, and its great competitive advantage for supporting electromobility and renewables. Secondly, I think Your focus on scaling has been so important, and the last point you made about the need for blended finance to attract private finance, and the challenge you pose to central banks. And here we're benefiting from both your great knowledge as governor of Central Bank of Brazil and now looking at it from the IDB perspective of how central banks may help catalyze through new instruments or other means greater flows with the urgent task of mitigating to climate change. And also very interesting, all you said about different instruments, including debt for nature and debt for climate change, swaps, and fantastic the role that you and the IDB are playing in these new instruments, as well as the methodologies you're using for all new loans to be completely Paris aligned. I think these challenges that you pose, the achievements that the IDB is doing, are extremely important. And I think it's also very valuable that you raise the issue of greater need for capital of the multilateral development banks. Now, finally, last, certainly not least, we will have Deborah Revoltella, who is chief economist at the IDB and has been leading a lot of work in this field. Since her arrival, she has designed, in particular, led the work of the flagship publications such as the European Investment Bank Investment Report, and she launched the idea and led the process for the design and implementation of the very valuable EIB Investment Survey. And she's a member of different steering committees at the European level, like the Euro 50 group. So, Deborah, I would like to ask you if you can talk in the same framework as Ilan, focusing perhaps on issues like tight regulations on MDBs and the restrictions they can pose to the role for green investment, and very importantly, how the EIB is planning to become a green bank, which by 2025 will have half of its loan directly towards low carbon projects. And also how you see the role of central banks and financial regulators and supervisors in enhancing green investment. And finally, what actions the EIB is planning to undertake to contribute to the green transition. We look forward to your presentation very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and it's really an honor to participate in this panel. And I will take the opportunity of being the chief economist in the panel to take a double rule. So on one side, speaking about what the European Investment Bank is and does in its role as a EU climate bank, but also the why and how we have defined our process in order to understand better the best way for us to help in the delivery of the net zero transition and help contain the vulnerability and cost associated to the transformation. So I just briefly start saying what is the European Investment Bank? Is an NDB. The European member states as our shareholders. We have a lending volume of some 70 billion per year, and it's 90% normally is at the European level and 10% is out of Europe, which make us a very big NDB also out of Europe. So we have both the European component and the extra European component, quite important. So we, starting in 2019, we started defining our transformation into being a climate bank, and that implied a very strong internal transformation, including a roadmap that we are clearly following in terms of where we want to go and how we achieve this internal transformation. And I think this is very important, because in the moment in which you want to embrace in such a change, you really need to have even internally an accountability process of how to move. But I was saying that in my remark, I would like to speak about how we define our activities, to define how to best deliver in the net zero transition. And if you consider even just only the economic side, I think we have to have in mind that the net zero transition is a major macroeconomic and geopolitical transformation. This is a change in relative prices that will have a massive reallocation of resources and economic powers within countries and across countries. And the incentives to act very much depends and vary according to who holds assets, who holds the resources that support the current economic model and the future economic model, but also who is developing technologies and who is investing in developing this technology. So you have to have a clear understanding of this process to know as an institution how to best contribute. And on the research side, and that's the first part of my intervention, what we see is really the important role of institutions that act globally to support this transformation. We developed a climate country risk model at the EIB that covers 180 countries around the world, having a view of physical and transition risk. What I found very interesting is if you look at the physical risk, is that actually the countries that are most at risk in terms of losses due to the physical risk are also often countries that have a lower capacity to deal with the shocks and to respond both on the fiscal and institutional point of view. So the transformation, and I think what was said before, that it's important for NDB to be present also to support the creation of the environment for the transformation, but also support with the process and with the investment process, I think is very important. If we look more at the micro level, one area that we tend to work a lot on the research side is try to understand what motivates economic actors to invest for the net zero transition and how to deliver on this investment. At the European level, we estimate that investment for the net zero transition has to increase by 500 billion per year, more than this around 700 billion that we are investing now. It's something is a big transformation, it's something big but affordable. But the point is understanding it has to come from the private and public sector, but how do you make the private sector invest and go in this transition? And then on the research side, we try to understand what motivates a single actor to invest. And looking at the European level, we see both that if we look at the physical risk, in Europe overall, you would have 60% of firms that have experienced physical risk, 90% of municipalities, but the adaptation seems to be relatively low. Investing for adaptation is at 35% of firms and 60% of municipality. So in fact, you have a lot of institutions, firms, municipalities that experience the risk but don't do anything. So there is a lot to do in terms of awareness and also shifting the culture that adaptation has only to be in the public sector, but also bringing it more into an action that can be also taken over by the private sector. In terms of transition risk, we notice that in Europe, mostly you have 35% of firms that think that the transition is a risk, 25% that think it's an opportunity. But also you see, if you look at the firms according to their energy intensity, the most energy intensive really only see the risk, and the low energy incentive see some opportunity, but could see more. So even in that point of view, I think I was fascinated about what Agion was telling us before, a little bit losing the line. But we may have various market failures at place, and you may need a combination of policy instruments. And at the European level, yes, we have carbon prices, but in other cases, incentive and policy action may be quite useful to support investment going on. And if we look at what constrains investment, we really see a combination of factors going for awareness, going from the need to combine not only the carbon prices, but also some subsidies. And also what is clear is that it needs to be certainty on the policy direction and the policy instrument. Uncertainty is the biggest enemy of investment, and uncertainty on policy action will affect every investment in calculating the economic rate of return, so may constrain future activities. And another thing that we see is that actually lack of skills is a major impediment in the net zero transition, even at the European level, impeding investment taking place. And then barriers coming from regulatory fragmentation and bureaucracy may be an impediment. So if this is the economic understanding of what motivates the need to intervene and support, what is the European Investment Bank doing? As I was saying, since 2019, we have been transforming into the European Climate Bank. We have been aligning all our lending to the ambition of a resilient low carbon future. And in fact, the way in which we have done it is to put a firm commitment that binds what we can do or not do as an institution. First of all, we were putting target in terms of our lending, a proportion of lending from climate action and environmental sustainability, some 50%. In fact, we already, it's the second year that we overtake the limit, being at 58% of our climate action and environmental sustainability. We have also aligned completely our portfolio since 2021 to the Paris Agreement. And also we have developed, because finance is fungible, we don't only assess the project that we invest, but we also assess the counterpart. And actually we ask our counterpart to have a very clear decarbonization path. And if we assess their decarbonization plans, and if they don't provide enough disclosure, we would contractually ask to provide the additional disclosure to be sure that we interact with counterpart that share the same decarbonization strategies. And then we are also acting as a bank in the sense that we use our risk management, we are adapting it to climate risk management practice, and we are driver for the development of the green and sustainable capital markets. And in fact, we have been transforming a big share of our fundraising is in green and sustainable climate bonds. But the other part that is quite important, and it's coming out from our research side, but we clearly have as a point in our lending activities, that one of the constraining factors in the net zero transition is availability of skills. So technical capacity is fundamental for knowing, for the development of project, the design of project, and the implementation of project. So we are working quite a lot in terms of technical assistance, both in Europe and out of Europe, for supporting the net zero transition. And at the operational level, what we do is, I think, is quite unique. We have a team of engineers and economists, some 500 engineers and economists that are internal at the institution and that assess each and every project, both ex ante and ex post. So we have the full alignment of the project to our energy lending policies. So that is a quite restrictive energy lending policy aligned to the Paris Agreement principle. And through that way, we are sure that all our portfolio is completely aligned. And we have been looking in new instrument like sector-based lending, also to take into account issues like biodiversity and integrate it into the framework of sectoral transformation. We have a particular focus, I was saying now, on adaptation. It's we realize that at the world level, but also at the European level, there is not enough focus on adaptation investment, and we develop a special strategy with a specific target in terms of increasing the adaptation activity at the European at the global level, sorry, both in Europe and out of Europe, embedding it in the project assessment and the project preparation for all projects that we are developing. And now the new area of development is related to the new environmental framework that we put in place in 2022 that takes into account pollution, sustainable use of water, the circular economy, quite important, and biodiversity. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and it's related to technologies and the development of technologies. As I was just saying, I was interested when Agiona mentioned the fact that you may need to combine, have more instrument in the presence of more market failures. And I think on the development of new technologies, the important element to consider is that in Europe already we have issues with the scaling up of firms, and these are also important in the context of the technology for the net zero transition. So we have been working very much supporting this scaling up of innovative companies on the one side, but also we have a number of projects that try to be first of a kind project, exemplary project for the industrialization of some of the most advanced technologies in order to prepare for the replication. The same happens with renewable energy deployment, where we try to intervene also a lot in a first of a kind project to try to have the demonstration effect. And in terms of technology, I think particularly when we think at all the resources that will be needed in the net zero transition and the geopolitical issues that this generate, we think that a particularly strong role should be placed in innovation related to the circular economy and the recycling. And this is an area which we think it's quite important to continue to develop. And then just last mentioning, I think to deliver all this investment, the business environment is incredibly important, as well as the availability of skills. So it's not only the finance that matters, but is the regulatory context in place and the availability of skills. And on that, we very much work in terms of technical assistance and advisory. Your last question, and with that I will conclude, is in terms of what should the central bank do and how they can support. I think one important element is related to the supervisory side. I think through the supervisory side, we are at the moment in which, at least in Europe, we have a clear assessment of the financial sector and the bank's exposure to climate risk. And this is going to an assessment of the cost of risk associated. For the time being, data availability and quality of data is really the problem, but is a process that is developing over time. And in this process, the supervisory part of a central bank, if it's integrated, can be quite useful in making sure that we don't create a bubble in the transition on one side, underestimating or overestimating the cost of risk associated. So that's, I think, is a very important point for a central bank in this moment. And then to deliver on investment, stability of the macroeconomic environment is important in any case. Without stability in a context of uncertainty, investment just doesn't happen. And that's definitely macroeconomic stability is a central rule of central banks. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for a very comprehensive presentation. Your emphasis on the IB being a climate bank. You're already lending 58% to low carbon activities, which is very impressive and a great example, I think, for the international community. And you made a number of very important points. I'm afraid that time is our enemy because we have the high-level panel now. So I would like to finish by thanking you both, as well as Nick Stern, who had to leave. I don't know if you can maybe have 30 seconds each. It's very restrictive about a key takeaway or a key point you want to make. Ilan, would you like to do that?
Thank you, Stephanie. I believe that, as I mentioned, we have a daunting challenge here. We have a transition, and we were talking about the macroeconomic transition and the cost. But the daunting task is the scale of what we need to do. And MDBs have been asked to help in that. We are pushing for that. There's quite a limited capital you can do. You can maximize it, but we need to mobilize other resources. We need to help private capital to come. And this task has to be done together with the central bank community and other regulators. How we give the incentives to have more investment in climate mitigation, adaptation. How do we do it? We regulate, we supervise, but can we do more than that? Can we have new instruments? Can we be able to together attract more resources? So I mentioned a bit of financial instruments, but I think we can think more exploratory on where can we work together to be able to generate the resources that this challenge requires. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan, for that really important point and this challenge that you leave us for a dialogue between multilaterals and central banks on what we can do more together in this urgent task. Deborah, 30 seconds.
Yes, also on my side, I think very much the 2 points are the scaling up on the one side, and the other side is the development of skills. I think that, again, skills and knowing what to do is even a scarcer resources than financing. So the knowledge part of what to do, and also the creation of what I was mentioning briefly before, creating reliable data in terms of the cost of climate risk. I think it's something quite important, and where we need the official sector community and the private sector community to work together to create this data.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both of you and to Nick. And we will have now in 10 minutes the high-level panel, which is the last session, and very important session, so I invite all participants to listen as well. And thank you very, very much for a really excellent and very substantive set of presentations and discussion. Thank you very much. Ahora cierro.
Thank
you
you
very much,
Bye-bye.
Stephanie. We will now take a break. The conference will resume at 4:30 p.m. Central European Summer Time with our final event, the high-level panel entitled Climate, Tech and Transition in the Real Economy, What Central Banks Should Know and Do About It. It is an event that you want to miss, so stay tuned and do come back to join us. Thank you very much.